Welcome to Medieval Germanica. I am your host, Brandon Foster, and today we are going to peek into the life of the first Frankish king, Clovis. Now, before we get into it, we're going to talk about some of the little things about his life, what he accomplished, the campaigns he waged, the religious conversions he went through, and all the different things that made Clovis I tick and why he is considered the first French king and why he is important to history in general. So, if you enjoy Germanic history, which is what I talk about here at Medieval Germanica, then get your cup of coffee or really whatever drink you like to partake in, and let's dive into some history. Clovis I was born around 466. We don't know the exact year he was born because at that time there weren't really any annals or kind of political timelines being created. Later, around Charlemagne, that is when we get the Frankish annals, and they go from about the 740s all the way up to the 820s. And they tell us a lot about that period, but during the 460s we didn't really have any of that. So we believe that he was born around 466 based off of different clues and comments of Gregory of Tours, who was our main historical primary source. Now, if you know anything about history and what other things are going on at that time, a decade later, when Clovis is about 10, would be considered the fall of the Roman Empire, or the Western Roman Empire. Now, when historians talk about the fall of the Western Roman Empire, it is something that has been under heavy debate the last few decades, partly because it used to be thought, under a kind of Italiocentric viewpoint, that when the barbarian tribes, as the Romans called them, the Germanic tribes, when they came into southern Europe and central Europe from northern Europe, that this was the collapse of civilization as we had known it, and it would take centuries until civilization was rebuilt and wouldn't really start happening until the Renaissance. So any time between the year about 500 to 1500, while considered different kind of sub-periods, so you had the Dark Ages and then what's called the High Renaissance, for a long time they were considered kind of lesser periods of history, especially what they called the Dark Ages. This was when kind of all learning disappeared and the world, especially Europe, kind of just entered this period of academic kind of stupery. But we now know that's not the case. We have discovered more sources, we have pinpointed more sources, and we now know that the Dark Ages, or what's now called the early medieval period, or the migration period, or the low medieval period, lots of different names for it, we now know that this time didn't have the collapse that they once thought it did. It was more of a shifting of power. So in 476, the power shifted from Rome into Gaul. And this would happen in a couple different ways. One, a character we'll talk about in a little bit named Syagrius, he tried to create what was called a rump kind of empire in Gaul, meaning a small kind of hard to exactly describe what rump means in this scenario, but it was a weaker form of its Roman version. And Clovis would end that, but we'll get to that in a minute. So in 466, Clovis is born. A decade later, power in Rome would cease in the Western realm. Now Constantinople, Byzantium, that would reign for another 1,000 years or so and would be doing just fine until the fall, when the Turks and kind of the Crusades would happen. Now, we do know, based off of more concrete chronicles, that he died in 511 AD. So he was in his late 40s when he passed away, late 50 or early 50s, somewhere around there. And this was normal for that time, young for us, but normal back then. And he did live a full life, as we'll talk about through this podcast. Now, his parents were Childeric I and Basina, who was a Thuringian princess. So the Thuringians were another Germanic tribe, and she was taken from that tribe and married to Childeric, who was a Frank. Now, the Franks came in multiple different flavors, and they were really a collection, what historians call a confederation. Confederati is what, the Romans called that. And this was a collection of different tribes that all came together for political and military purposes. So, as a Frank, he was a Salian Frank. This was the group that lived on the western half of the Rhine, amongst other groups, and this would be the group that would eventually kind of take most of the French name. While the other group, which I apologize, I'm going to butcher this name, were the Ruperian Franks. And that would become the more German Franks. Both Franks would create the German and French nations of today, the people groups, cultures, which is why when we have kings like Clovis and kings like Charlemagne, both groups kind of call them their own, because they both can rightfully do so. But that does get a little confusing. So Childeric was Clovis's father, and they have a kind of semi-mystical, either grandfather, uncle, we're not exactly sure the family connection between a man named Merovich and Clovis. So Merovich is where the historians get the name of the Merovingian dynasty. It comes from Merovich, and we don't have a lot of writings about him. We think there was a person by the name of Merovich, but we're not 100% sure if what we are told about him is true. And him and Childeric were more of regional lords than they were kings, which is why Clovis is considered the first king of a unified Francia, because he was the one that united the Franks, and he's the one that bore the crown in a more legitimate way than his father or grandfather, uncle, whoever Merovich was. Now, for a second, I want to dive into a little bit of linguistic fun, because there is some history behind the name of Clovis and some controversy, though historical controversy, so nothing huge, but I think it's interesting. So in Latin, his name was Clodovicus. Now, this is where we get Clodovich, and this is the closer to the Frankish name that would then eventually become Clovis. Now, his Frankish name was Chlodovig, and it actually is broken into two sections. So something that the Franks would do they would combine different words to make names. This is very common throughout most cultures. You have this a lot in Jewish culture, where you would have like Yeshua is God saves us, stuff like that. So it's very common for a name to have a lot of meaning. So Clovis, or Chlodovig, breaks down into Chludas and Vigana. Chludas means loud or famous, and Vigana means to battle, to fight. So basically his name means something like famous warrior or renowned in battle. So a very warlike name for a warlike people, so it works. But this is where the controversy happens. A lot of the name comes from, again, Gregory of Tours. He was the big person. He was a abbot, or I think, of Tours, and he's the one that wrote down the history of the Franks up until his life, I believe in the late 6th century. So he wrote, but he wasn't great at Latin. Now Latin, one thing that did occur during this period was as Rome, or Roman power, kind of fell back into Italy, things such as writing did decrease. They never left, but they decreased. A lot of the best writers and the schools in the area left. They went back into Italy as turmoil was brought in. So Gregory was not great at writing. He could write, he knew Latin, but he didn't know it in an elegant or academic way. That would start happening again under Charlemagne and the Carolingian Renaissance that he would commence starting in the 790s. Then Latin would start having a resurgence, and they would start copying to a much higher degree of skill than there was for the last few centuries. And then going on, a lot of those copies would go into the 12th to 15th century when the Renaissance would begin, the one we talk about in history a lot. So Gregory of Tours was not great, and he made what we think were possible writing errors, especially when it came to forming his letters. So what chlodas could have been was actually, if I can find it real quick, chluta. So chluta could have been the root word he was writing from, and it means lot, share, or portion. So either Clovis's name was lute bringer or renowned in battle, depending on the Frankish variation that he was trying to write from. Just a little side note, I thought I'd add it in there. I thought it was cool, and I hope you do too. So that brings us to all of his early life, and let's now talk about what he was known for. So I've already mentioned quickly that he was known for uniting all the Franks. That was a big thing that he did. He was also known for converting to Catholicism instead of Arian Christianity, which most Germans at that time practiced. And he is known for starting the Merovingian dynasty. Again, while it was named for his grandfather, whoever the character is, he is the one that really started the dynasty. And unfortunately, it does not bear his name, though the Clovisian dynasty just doesn't sound the same. Well, I guess the Childeric dynasty, that would be sound pretty good. But, so, he took the throne in 481. This is when he really started his life and what he is known for. So he was about the age of 15, and he really just started off with a bang. So in 486, so about 5 years into his reign, he had one of the most impressive battles of his career, which was the Battle of Soissons. Now, I apologize to any French. I am not always great at pronouncing French words. Some I think I'm okay with. I haven't really mastered my French yet. So on the list of life goals. So the Battle of Soissons happened again in 486 AD, and it was between the Germans and the guy Syagrius, who I mentioned a little bit before. So Syagrius was a Roman general who had taken power in Gaul, and he was trying to recreate the Roman Empire with that as his base. So on against him, we had Ragnacar, who was the king of Cambrai, and we had Childeric, who was another Frankish king, and then of course Clovis. So three of them fought Syagrius. They won, but there was a little betrayal along the way. Childeric decided to break away from his two fellow compatriots, and he betrayed them. Now, Syagrius still lost. Childeric went into a monastery, I do believe, and we would see him again later. But that was the end of the betrayal. The war was won, and the last remnant of the Roman Empire in the Western world had faded. Other battles that would commence during that time was the Battle of Verdun and Paris. This is some besieges. We're not exactly sure how long Paris lasted. Verdun was kind of a quick siege, but the siege of Paris may have lasted all the way up to 5 years. Now, if anyone that knows Paris or Paris's history, it had very impressive walls. And so it was a very difficult place to besiege because it was right next to the river, and it was difficult. It was well positioned. But he still was able to win, and he was able to take Paris for his own. Not only did he conquer Paris, but he also added it as his capital to the Frankish kingdom. So that is why, to this day, Paris is still a very important city as the capital of France. It has always been a very significant city politically, economically, and even religiously. Because he would build the Abbey of St. Peter and Paul on the south side of the Seine. So he would add some abbeys that were very important to the area, and it was just all very good stuff. So after he besieged Verdun and Paris, he also went on to conquer a couple different areas. He conquered the Alemanni, the Visigoths, and the other Frankish nations that hadn't come under his power yet. So the Alemanni lived in eastern Gaul, and they were ruled under King Alaric. Now, King Alaric was he's a famous king in the area, and he claimed, or Clovis claimed, that he was actually liberating the Catholic Germans from their Arian kind of overlord. And so, again, most Germans were Arian, but some were Catholic. Eventually, Clovis would convert to Catholicism. I don't think he was at this time. And so he decided that he was going to free them. He might have been Catholic and wanted to free his fellow Catholics. Either way, he said it was a war of liberation. So he was able to beat them at the Battle of... sorry, that's the Visigoths, not the Alemanni, who I thought I was talking about. The Alemanni lived in East Gaul, and they were defeated at the Battle of Tolbiac. Then the Visigoths under King Alaric were a battle of liberation. Then we have the Battle of Volay. This is where Clovis finished conquering all the Franks and cementing his power in the area. Primarily, the Frankish kingdom at that time was modern France, Switzerland, and a little bit of Germany. It didn't go into where the Saxons were, the Avars, the Lombards, Visigoths, any of the other areas yet. That was under Charlemagne. He would eventually conquer all the way from the Spanish Pyrenees all the way up to the North Sea and into where the Slavic nations would eventually be on the eastern side of Europe. But with all the conquests and everything done, Clovis still was not finished with all of his work. He had a few individuals now who didn't quite bow to the knee as well as he would have liked. So he disposed of them in the good old-fashioned way, assassination. So he assassinated Childeric, who we talked about a little while ago. He was the guy that defected against them during their first battle against Syagrius, and he was put into a monastery. Now, he was trying to leave that monastery and cause some problems. So Clovis had him assassinated. Then, another man who we haven't talked about too much, he played into some other politics that I decided not to go into at this time, and his name is Childeric. Now, I know it's very similar, but different people. And he was convinced to kill his father, Sigebert. I know these names are fantastic. So Sigebert was a prominent leader, and Childeric was, he killed him, and then Clovis just turned around and had Childeric assassinated as well. Okay. Get your guy to do the dirty work and then do it yourself. The last person was Ragnacar. He refused to let Clovis enter his territory, and if you remember, he was the other guy that helped with the Battle of Soissons, so he had gotten a little too, haughty in his breeches. And so Clovis just had him taken care of by his own men, and then he incorporated his territory. So now all the assassinations are done, the wars are done. The last two main things that Clovis is known for didn't have to do with war. So as his old age was commencing into his 40s, and so he did two main things. Both of them happened around the year 508. So first, he was baptized because he had become a Catholic Christian before that, and he eventually became baptized. And the other thing was that he wrote down the Salian laws. So up to this point, the laws in Germany, or all the Germanic tribes, were oral laws. They had spoken them. The town elders, the village elders, the war chiefs, they knew the laws. And if anything ever needed to be judged, then you went to the elders, and they would take care of it, and they would just know the laws, and they would hand them down to the next generation, so on and so forth. But now that the Germanic tribes had become Germanic kingdoms, lots of these different tribes were creating laws. We have the Lombardic laws, we have the Frankish laws, we have the Anglo-Saxon laws, and there's a few others. And it was codifying these unspoken or really spoken laws. Now we know two different things, and I won't go too much into it now. I'll make a whole video on its own. But we know that not all the laws were written down. These were just the laws that were confusing or that needed to be spoken. The ones that were just so commonplace, they didn't write those down. And we also know that since the Frankish kingdoms were a diverse population, that they needed to differentiate. This is called the law of personality. And this meant that if you were Frank, you were tried by Frankish law. If you were Gallo-Roman, you were judged by Gallo-Roman laws. If you were Lombard, so far, you get the point. And so they needed to codify, because if there were judges that were trying to judge, who was what, but they weren't Frankish or Lombard or whatever, they needed to know what the laws were. So Clovis is known as the Germanic lawgiver. He's the one that wrote it down. So this also happened around the same time that he was baptized. And also during this time, he had the first Council of Orléans. This is when 33 bishops came into Orléans, and they created 31 decrees on the duties and obligations of individuals. And one big thing was making the conquered and the conqueror equal. This was under Christian law. Basically, under Christ, we're all equal. So this was a very important thing. A lot of these things would really kind of cement where France and Germany would go as their cultures and histories would progress compared to other nations. Now, one of the big things, or one of the big reasons why he was baptized into Catholicism and not Arianism was because of his wife Clotilda. And this will be the last thing that we talk about before we kind of wrap things up. So Clotilda was a Burgundian princess, and they were married most of his life, and they had a couple children together. And she was Catholic. He was pagan when they first were married, and he had a choice, if he wanted to convert, to go to either Arian or Catholic Christianity. Arianism was considered a heresy at that time, still is today, and it is a belief that Christ and God were not the same, meaning they denied the Trinity. So they believed that Jesus was a distinct human individual that was not part of the Trinity, and that went against Catholic teaching. So again, most Germans believed the Arian, which went along very well with many of their Norse beliefs, while the Catholic was a very different thought. So she convinced him eventually to become Catholic. She actually baptized 2 of their children against his will. The first one died, which probably did not help his thinking about Catholicism. The second one lived, but it did almost die as well. I'm not sure exactly what caused these deaths. But eventually, again in 508, he would be baptized, and this would cement Catholicism in the Frankish lands, which is why up to this day, Catholicism was a very powerful kind of philosophy and religion in both France and Germany, until, 1517 and all that. So, we have now gone through kind of the life of Clovis, the highlights. You could make very long videos, but I just wanted a highlight of his life. And now you know, if you didn't know before, why Clovis is considered the first king of really France and Germany. He's the first king of the Franks, and he is an incredibly important king in European history because, again, he was the one that cemented a kingdom in Central Europe, which really kind of changed the course of where Europe could have gone if somebody else had taken it over. So, I really hope you enjoyed that. If you like German history, I primarily talk about here in Medieval Germanica. I talk about medieval, early medieval, and ancient German history, but I really like to show how that pinpoints to modern times. So again, the reason why France and Germany are Christian, are Catholic, a lot of it has to go to him. So this really changed history of Europe. They were no longer pagan, and a lot of things developed because of this man. So if you are Catholic and you like where that went, you have him to thank. If you don't, well, you have him to blame. So now you have a person to blame or thank. Thank you for watching Medieval Germanica. Again, I'm your host, Brandon Foster. It would really appreciate and really grow my channel if you liked, commented, shared, all the good stuff. And no matter what you do, thank you for watching and have an amazing day.